I was shoved out of the family living room at the will reading. Then I dropped the deed that proved it was my house. The papers scattered across the hardwood floor like autumn leaves. My cousin Derek's hand was still firmly planted on my shoulder from where he'd pushed me, his fingers digging into my skin through my black dress. Everyone froze. My Aunt Marianne's coffee cup hovered midway to her lips, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the yellow document among the mess of papers. "What's that, Emma?" she asked, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes sharp as flint. I scrambled to gather the papers, my hands trembling. The old deed had been tucked inside my father's journal, which I'd brought to the reading for comfort more than anything else. I hadn't even known it was there until it slipped out. "Nothing," I mumbled, but it was too late. Uncle Robert, always the lawyer even at his brother's funeral, snatched the document before I could reach it. His reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he scanned the page, his expression darkening with each line. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. The living room of my childhood home suddenly felt foreign. The familiar worn leather sofa where Dad and I had watched countless baseball games. The stone fireplace where we'd roasted marshmallows during power outages. The bookshelves stuffed with his beloved mystery novels. All of it watched me like a stranger. "It was in Dad's journal," I said, clutching the leather-bound book to my chest. "I didn't know—" "This appears to be a deed," Robert announced to the room, transferring ownership of this property to Emma, dated 3 years ago. He looked up, meeting the shocked expressions of my relatives. If authentic, it supersedes the will. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around at the faces of my family, people I'd known all my life, but who had become increasingly distant since my father's illness. They'd swooped in during his final days, suddenly concerned and attentive after years of minimal contact. Now I understood why. My cousin Derek released my shoulder as if burned. "That can't be right," he said. "Uncle James wasn't in his right mind. Emma manipulated him." The accusation stung like a slap. My father, James Calloway, had been the most clear-headed person I knew right up until the cancer took him 2 weeks ago. Even through the pain and medication, his mind had remained sharp. "James mentioned nothing about this to any of us," Aunt Marianne said, setting down her coffee cup with a decisive clink. "And we spoke regularly." That was a lie. She'd called maybe twice a year, on Christmas and his birthday. It was I who had moved back home from Chicago 3 years ago when Dad's diagnosis came through. I who had driven him to chemo appointments, held his hand through the worst nights, and learned to make his favorite meals when nothing else would tempt his appetite. "Mr. Finch," I addressed my father's attorney, who had been silently observing the chaos, "did you know about this deed?" Harold Finch adjusted his bow tie, looking uncomfortable. "Your father had me prepare it, yes. He wanted to ensure you would have a home regardless of other considerations." His eyes darted toward my relatives. "This is absurd," Uncle Robert spluttered. "The will clearly states that the house is to be sold and the proceeds divided among the family. Emma already gets his investment portfolio." The investment portfolio was modest at best. Dad had been a high school history teacher with a careful but hardly extensive approach to saving. The real value was in this house. The Victorian home my great-grandfather had built in 1898, now sitting on 3 acres of prime real estate in what had become one of Boston's most desirable suburbs. "Perhaps we should continue the will reading," Mr. Finch suggested diplomatically, "and then address any discrepancies." I reclaimed my seat on the window bench, the furthest point from the family cluster. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass cast blue and amber patterns across my hands as Mr. Finch continued reading. I barely heard him. My mind was racing, piecing together conversations with Dad over the past few years. "This house is your birthright, Emmy," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch swing. 5 generations of Calloways have lived under this roof." I'd assumed it was just nostalgia talking. Now I realized he'd been telling me something important. When Mr. Finch finished reading. The tension in the room was palpable. According to the will, dated 4 years ago, the house was indeed to be sold. But the deed in Uncle Robert's hands, notarized and filed with the county according to the stamp, told a different story. "I'll need to verify the authenticity of this document," Robert said, folding it carefully and sliding it into his breast pocket. "That belongs to Emma," Mr. Finch said quietly but firmly. "It's a legal record of her property." "I'm just going to have it examined," Robert replied smoothly, "as executor of the estate." "You're not the executor," Mr. Finch interrupted. "James named me as executor in his will, as I've just read aloud." Colour rose in Robert's cheeks. "As James's brother and a practicing attorney, please return the deed to Ms. Calloway," Mr. Finch insisted, extending his hand. For a moment, I thought Robert would refuse. Then Aunt Marianne touched his arm gently. "Robert," she murmured, "not now." With obvious reluctance, he removed the deed from his pocket and handed it to Mr. Finch, who promptly passed it to me. I took it with trembling fingers, scanning the familiar handwriting of my father's signature. "We should discuss this as a family," Aunt Marianne said, her voice gentle but her eyes cold. "Emma, surely you don't want to create discord when we're all grieving." The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. Where was this concern for family harmony when Dad was sick and needed help? Where was it when I called to tell them the hospice nurse thought it would be a matter of days, and they said they'd try to make it, but didn't arrive until an hour after he'd passed? "I think we've all had enough for today," I said, rising from the window bench. "Mr. Finch, thank you for coming. I'll walk you out." The dismissal was clear. My relatives exchanged glances but made no move to leave. "Emma," Uncle Robert began, but I cut him off. "I need some time," I said firmly. "We can talk tomorrow." I escorted Mr. Finch to the front door, the deed clutched in my hand like a shield. On the porch, away from prying ears, he turned to me. "Your father anticipated this reaction," he said quietly. "There's a letter in my office that he asked me to give you if the deed became a point of contention. Can you come by tomorrow?" I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "And Emma," he added, "you might want to stay somewhere else tonight, just until things settle." A chill ran through me despite the warm June air. "This is my home," I said. "I'm not leaving." Mr. Finch looked worried but didn't argue. "Call me if you need anything, any time." As his car pulled away, I stood on the porch watching the sunlight fade behind the old oak trees that lined my property. The weight of ownership settled on my shoulders, both a burden and a gift. Inside, I could hear the murmur of voices. My family was planning something, but so was I. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in Dad's study, going through his papers by the light of his old desk lamp. The leather chair still held the impression of his body, and if I closed my eyes, I could almost smell his cologne, sandalwood, and something uniquely him. The journal that had contained the deed held other secrets too. Dad had documented conversations, kept copies of emails, and made notes about phone calls with family members over the years. It was all there, the gradual distancing, the thinly veiled inquiries about his will, the suggestions that he sell the house and move into something more manageable. Robert called again about the developer's offer. One entry from 2 years ago read, "Told him the same thing I've said for years. This house stays in the family, specifically with Emma. He doesn't understand that some things are worth more than money." Another entry, dated 6 months before his death. "Marianne stopped by unexpectedly today. First visit in 3 years. Brought a real estate agent friend who just happened to have comps for the neighborhood. Emma was at the pharmacy picking up my prescriptions. When she returned, Marianne and her friend left quickly. Coincidence? I think not. My father had seen through them all along. By morning, I had a plan, or at least the beginnings of one. I showered, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, and made coffee in the big kitchen where Dad had taught me to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs when I was 7. I was sipping from my mug, watching the sunrise through the kitchen window, when the doorbell rang. It was barely 7:30 a.m. Uncle Robert stood on the porch, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit despite the early hour. Behind him, I could see Aunt Marianne and Cousin Derek waiting in a black SUV parked in the driveway. "We need to talk, Emma," he said without preamble. "It's early," I replied, not inviting him in. "This can't wait. We've been up all night discussing the situation and we have a proposal." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "The deed," he continued, "raises some complex legal questions. Your father was on heavy medication. There could be issues of competency, undue influence. He wasn't on heavy medication 3 years ago," I interrupted. "He was in remission, hiking, teaching full-time, hardly incompetent." Robert waved a dismissive hand. "Regardless, contesting the deed could tie up the estate for years. Nobody wants that. What do you want, Uncle Robert? We're prepared to offer you a fair settlement. You keep the investment portfolio as stated in the will, plus an additional $200,000 from the sale of the house. The remainder would be divided as per the will's instructions. The house was worth at least $1.8 million in the current market. What he was offering amounted to less than a quarter of my rightful inheritance." "That's very generous," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'll have to decline." His expression hardened. "Emma, be reasonable. You're a single woman with a modest career. You can't maintain a property like this on a librarian's salary." The condescension in his tone made my blood boil. Yes, I was a librarian, a profession I loved, and one that my father had always respected. And yes, the upkeep on a historic home was substantial, but that was my concern, not his. "I've managed for the past 3 years while caring for Dad," I pointed out. "I think I'll be fine." That was different. "You had your father's income, his pension, which I now inherit," I finished for him, "along with the house, legally, with a properly filed deed." Robert's jaw tightened. "We're trying to be fair here, Emma, but if you force our hand, we'll contest the deed and the will. It could get ugly. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. Think about what your father would want. Would he want his family torn apart over material possessions?" The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost laughable. My father wanted me to have this house. He made that abundantly clear by deeding it to me while he was alive and of sound mind. And as for family, I gestured toward the SUV where Marianne and Derek waited. "Where were all of you when he needed family?" Robert's face flushed. "We had our own lives, our own responsibilities, and now you have your own homes to go back to," I finished. "This one is mine." I started to close the door, but Robert stuck his foot in the jam. "You haven't heard our final offer," he said. $300,000, plus we drop any claims to the contents of the house. All the furniture, art, everything stays with you." I almost laughed. "The contents are already mine by default since the house is mine. You're offering me money for what I already legally own. No deal." With a firm push, I closed the door despite his resistance. Through the beveled glass, I watched him stand there for a moment, his face a mask of barely controlled anger, before he turned and stalked back to the SUV. They didn't leave immediately. I watched from behind the curtains as they sat in the vehicle, obviously discussing their next move. Finally, the SUV backed down the driveway and disappeared down Maple Street. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The confrontation had left me shaky, but more determined than ever. I needed to see Mr. Finch and read that letter. His office was in a converted Victorian, not unlike my own home, though smaller and divided into professional suites. The brass plaque beside the door read, "Harold Finch, Attorney at Law," in simple, dignified lettering. His secretary, a woman in her 60s with a cap of silver hair, smiled warmly as I entered. "Ms. Calloway, we've been expecting you. Mr. Finch is just finishing up a call. Can I get you some tea while you wait?" "No, thank you, Mrs. Chen, I'm fine." I sat in one of the comfortable leather chairs, my eyes drawn to the bookshelves lining the walls. Dad had always said you could tell a lot about a person by their books. Mr. Finch's collection spoke of a man with wide-ranging interests. Legal texts, certainly, but also history, philosophy, and classical literature. Emma, Mr. Finch appeared in the doorway of his inner office. "Please come in." His office was warm and inviting, with a large desk of polished oak and windows overlooking a small garden. He gestured for me to sit in one of the visitors' chairs while he retrieved a manila envelope from a drawer. "Your father left this with me about a year ago," he explained, handing it to me. "He was very specific about when it should be given to you. The envelope was sealed with red wax, impressed with what I recognized as my father's college ring, a detail so like him that my eyes welled with tears. "Would you like some privacy?" Mr. Finch asked gently. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Take all the time you need. I'll be just outside." When the door closed behind him, I carefully broke the seal and removed several folded pages covered in my father's distinctive handwriting. "My dearest Emmy, if you're reading this, then the deed to our home has become a point of contention, as I feared it might. First, let me be absolutely clear. The house is yours, legally and morally. I transferred ownership to you 3 years ago, not only to avoid probate, but because it was the right thing to do. You are the one who cherishes this home as I do, who understands its value beyond mere dollars. I suspect my brother Robert has made you an offer significantly below the property's worth. He's always been practical to a fault, seeing value only in financial terms. What he fails to understand, what he has always failed to understand, is that some inheritances cannot be measured in bank balances. This house holds our family's history in its very bones. Your great-great-grandfather built it with his own hands. Your grandmother was born in the upstairs bedroom that later became your nursery. I taught you to ride a bicycle in the driveway, and we planted the cherry tree in the backyard together after your mother left. These are the true inheritances I leave you: memories, roots, a sense of belonging. Robert and Marianne chose different paths long ago, moving away, prioritizing careers and status. There's nothing wrong with their choices, but they forfeited any moral claim to this house when they stopped seeing it as a home and started seeing it as an asset. Now, practical matters. If they contest the deed, Harold has all the necessary documentation to prove I was of sound mind when I signed it. The transfer was properly filed with the county registrar. It is ironclad. However, I know my brother, and he can be persistent when he believes he's right. So I've left you something else, something even he cannot argue with. In the attic, behind the false wall in the north corner, you remember the one, where we used to hide your Christmas presents, you'll find a metal box. The combination is your birthday, month, day, year. Inside is evidence that Robert has wanted this property for decades, not out of sentimentality, but because of what lies beneath it. About 15 years ago, a geological survey of the area indicated the possibility of natural gas deposits extending under several properties in the neighborhood, including ours. Robert approached me then about selling, though he never mentioned why. When I refused, he let it drop, but I always suspected he was biding his time. The survey results, correspondence with the energy company, and Robert's own letters to me are all in that box. If he persists in challenging your ownership, this information might prove useful. The irony is that I would never have allowed drilling on our land. The environmental risks are too great, and no amount of money is worth that. I suspect you feel the same. Emmy, my brave girl, I'm sorry to burden you with family conflict when you should be grieving. Know that I left this world content in the knowledge that you were by my side, that you loved me as deeply as I loved you. No father could ask for more. Stand your ground. This house is yours, as is my endless love. Dad, I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Even from beyond the grave, my father was protecting me, guiding me, believing in me. The revelation about the natural gas deposits explained so much. The sudden family interest, the persistent offers from developers, the urgency in Robert's negotiations. This wasn't about family legacy or even simple greed. It was about potential millions in mineral rights. I carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. When Mr. Finch came back in, I asked him about the geological survey mentioned in my father's letter. "Ah," he said, nodding thoughtfully. "Yes, James mentioned something about that. He was quite adamant about preserving the environmental integrity of the property. Did my uncle know that Dad had told you about this?" "I don't believe so. Your father was a private person in many ways, especially when it came to family matters." I stood, suddenly energized with purpose. "I need to go home and check something in the attic. Thank you, Mr. Finch, for everything." "Emma," he called as I reached the door. "Your father was very proud of you. He told me once that you were the only one who truly understood that wealth isn't just about money." I smiled through my tears. He taught me that. The drive home took only 15 minutes, but my mind raced the entire way. I needed to find that metal box before anyone else discovered its existence. As I turned onto Maple Street, my heart sank. The black SUV was parked in my driveway again. But this time, the front door of my house stood open. They were inside. I parked across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Taking a deep breath, I called 911. "There are intruders in my home," I told the dispatcher, keeping my voice low. "Family members who don't have permission to be there." After giving my address and declining the offer to wait for police before approaching, time was too critical. I ended the call and crossed the street. The front door was not just open, but showed signs of forced entry. The antique lock splintered. Fury replaced fear as I stepped into the foyer. The sound of movement came from upstairs, footsteps crossing the ceiling, doors opening and closing. They were searching for something. "Hello?" I called out, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "The police are on their way." The footsteps paused, then quickened. Uncle Robert appeared at the top of the stairs, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled, his tie loosened. "Emma," he said, his voice unnaturally calm, "this is a misunderstanding. We were concerned when you didn't answer your phone, thought something might have happened to you. So you broke down my door." I climbed the first few stairs, blocking his descent. "Where are Marianne and Derek?" As if on cue, my aunt emerged from my bedroom, her expression caught between guilt and defiance. "Emma, be reasonable. We're still in mourning. Everyone's emotions are running high. That doesn't explain why you've broken into my home." I continued up the stairs, forcing Robert to back up. "What are you looking for?" "Looking for?" Robert repeated, as if the concept was foreign to him. "We're not looking for anything. We came to talk, to work things out as a family." "By breaking and entering?" "That's a crime, Uncle Robert. As a lawyer, you should know that." His face hardened. "This house is part of James's estate, which is still in probate regardless of any supposed deed. As his next of kin, we have every right." "Save it for court," I cut him off. "Where's Derek?" A thump from above answered my question. The attic. Derek was in the attic. I pushed past Robert and Marianne, taking the smaller staircase that led to the 3rd floor. The attic door stood open, light spilling from inside. Derek was kneeling in the north corner, prying at the false wall panel with a crowbar. "Stop!" I shouted. He jumped, dropping the crowbar with a clatter. "Emma, I was just breaking into my private property, damaging my home, trespassing." I advanced on him, all the anger and grief of the past weeks channeling into this moment. "How did you even know about that panel?" Derek had the grace to look ashamed. "Uncle James showed me once, years ago, when I was a kid." "Of course." Derek had spent summers with us when he was younger, before college and career took him to California. He and Dad had been close then. The betrayal stung even deeper. "The police are on their way," I said. "I suggest all of you leave immediately." "Emma, please," Marianne started, having followed me up the stairs. "We can explain—" "I know exactly what you're looking for," I interrupted. "And why. Dad told me everything." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Robert appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from false concern to calculation. "What exactly did James tell you?" he asked carefully. "About the natural gas deposits? About how you've been trying to get your hands on this property for 15 years because of what's underneath it? All of it?" Robert's face drained of color. Marianne gasped softly. "That's absurd," Robert managed, but his voice lacked conviction. "James always had an overactive imagination. The geological survey from 2008, your letters, the correspondence with Eastern Energy Corporation, it's all documented." "Where?" Robert demanded, then caught himself. "I mean, what documentation? There's nothing to document." "Dad left evidence in a secure location," I lied smoothly, not wanting them to renew their search for the metal box, "with instructions to make it public if anything happened to me or if the deed to this house was contested." Ooh, the sound of sirens grew louder, approaching our street. Derek dropped the crowbar as if it had suddenly become red hot. "We should go," he muttered to his parents. "This isn't over," Robert said, his lawyer's composure returning. "That deed won't hold up in court. You manipulated my brother when he was vulnerable. Save it," I repeated. "The police can escort you out." They filed downstairs just as flashing lights illuminated the front windows. I followed, watching as 2 officers approached the broken front door. The next hour passed in a blur of police reports and statements. I showed the officers the deed to the house, explained that my relatives had broken in without permission, and declined to press charges, a decision I made not out of mercy but strategy. A police report documenting their illegal entry was leverage enough. Actual criminal charges might push them toward more desperate measures. When the police finally left, with my relatives gone and a temporary repair to the front door, I returned to the attic. The false panel had been partially pried open by Derek's efforts. I removed it the rest of the way, revealing the small alcove behind. The metal box was there, just as Dad had described. I entered my birthday on the combination lock, and it opened with a satisfying click. Inside was exactly what Dad had promised. The geological survey confirming natural gas deposits, letters from Robert dating back to 2008, pressuring Dad to sell, and correspondence with Eastern Energy Corporation discussing potential leasing arrangements for drilling rights. Most damning was a recent letter from Robert to Eastern Energy, dated just 2 months before Dad's death, discussing the imminent availability of the property and potential terms for mineral rights. He had been planning this, counting on Dad's death to get his hands on the property all along. I carefully photographed each document with my phone, then returned everything to the box. Rather than replacing it in the wall, I took it downstairs to my bedroom, where I locked it in the small safe hidden in my closet, another precaution Dad had insisted on years ago. Then I sat on the edge of my bed, the bed where I'd slept as a child, and returned to as an adult when Dad needed me, and let the tears come. Tears for my father, for the family bonds that greed had corrupted, for the peace that had been shattered in my home. When the tears subsided, I washed my face and made a cup of tea in the kitchen, sitting at the worn oak table where Dad and I had shared thousands of meals. The house creaked and settled around me, familiar sounds that had always brought comfort. "I won't let them take you," I whispered to the walls. "I promise." The next morning I called Mr. Finch and asked him to meet me for coffee at the small cafe on Main Street. I brought the metal box with me. "This changes things," he said, after reviewing the contents. Robert has exposed himself to potential legal action by Eastern Energy if they discover he was negotiating mineral rights for property he didn't own and had no reasonable expectation of acquiring. Can we use that? Mr. Finch smiled thinly. We can certainly suggest to Robert that Eastern Energy might be interested in these documents. His law practice depends on his reputation for integrity. I don't want to blackmail him, I said, uncomfortable with the idea despite everything. I just want him to leave me alone, to leave this house alone. Not blackmail, Mr. Finch corrected gently. Leverage. And sometimes, Emma, you need to fight fire with fire. I considered this, then nodded slowly. Set up a meeting, all of us, on neutral ground. I want this resolved. 2 days later, we gathered in a conference room at Mr. Finch's office, myself and Mr. Finch on one side of the table, Robert, Marianne, and Derek on the other. Robert had brought his own attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Patel, who specialized in estate litigation. Before we begin, Mr. Finch said, I want to be clear that this meeting is being recorded with the consent of all parties. He indicated a small device in the center of the table. Is that agreeable? After everyone nodded, he continued. We're here to resolve the matter of James Calloway's estate, specifically the ownership of the property at 127 Maple Street. Our position, Ms. Patel began, is that the deed transferring ownership to Ms. Calloway is invalid due to undue influence and the testator's diminished capacity at the time of signing. That position, Mr. Finch replied smoothly, is not supported by the facts. James Calloway was in remission and fully employed at the time the deed was executed. The transfer was properly witnessed, notarized, and recorded with the county. Additionally, he slid a folder across the table. We have Mr. Calloway's medical records from that period, showing no cognitive impairment whatsoever. Ms. Patel scanned the documents, her expression giving nothing away. Nevertheless, the timing of the transfer, done without the knowledge of other family members, suggests my father wasn't obligated to inform anyone of his decision regarding his own property, I interrupted. And as for timing, perhaps we should discuss why Uncle Robert was so interested in acquiring this particular property. Robert's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I placed a copy of his letter to Eastern Energy on the table. I'm stating facts. You've been trying to get your hands on that house for 15 years because of the natural gas deposits underneath it. You were negotiating mineral rights for property you didn't own, while my father was still alive. Miss Patel picked up the letter, reading it with growing concern. Mr. Calloway, you didn't disclose this to me. Robert's face flushed. It's not relevant to the validity of the deed. It speaks directly to motive, Mr. Finch countered, and, potentially, to fraudulent intent. Eastern Energy might be very interested to learn they were negotiating with someone who had no legal right to the property in question. That's preposterous, Robert sputtered. It was preliminary discussions only, contingent on the estate settlement. The letter suggests otherwise, Mr. Finch noted. It refers to imminent availability while James was still alive and outlines specific terms for drilling rights. Ms. Patel cleared her throat. I'd like a moment to confer with my clients privately. Mr. Finch and I stepped out, waiting in the small reception area while the murmur of heated discussion filtered through the closed door. They'll settle, Mr. Finch predicted quietly. Robert can't risk his professional reputation on this. He was right. When we returned to the conference room, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. My clients, Ms. Patel announced, are prepared to withdraw any claim to the property at 127 Maple Street in exchange for a confidentiality agreement regarding all matters discussed today. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by sadness. That it had come to this, legal threats and leverage rather than family supporting each other through grief, was a tragedy in itself. Agreed, I said softly. On one additional condition. Everyone looked at me expectantly. I want the family photos, I continued. The albums in the hall closet. The framed pictures you took from the living room shelves during the will reading. They have no monetary value, but they're part of our history. My history. Marianne had the grace to look ashamed. Of course, she said. I'll have them sent over tomorrow. Day. The legal details were worked out over the next hour. The withdrawal of any challenge to the deed, the confidentiality agreements, the division of the remaining assets as per the will. When we finally stood to leave, an awkward silence fell. Emma, Derek said suddenly, for what it's worth, I'm sorry about all of it. I studied my cousin's face, searching for sincerity and finding, to my surprise, that it seemed genuine. Thank you, I said simply. Robert and Marianne said nothing, their expressions a mixture of defeat and lingering resentment as they followed Ms. Patel out. When they were gone, I turned to Mr. Finch. Is it really over? He nodded. The deed stands unchallenged. The house is yours, as your father intended. And the natural gas? That's entirely your decision, he said, though I think James would be proud of whatever choice you make. I knew already what that choice would be. The following week, I contacted a conservation trust and began the process of placing an environmental easement on the property, permanently protecting it from drilling or development. The house would remain a home, not a resource to be exploited. As for the family division, some wounds take longer to heal than others. Derek called at Christmas, a tentative olive branch that I cautiously accepted. Robert and Marianne sent cards, but maintained their distance. Perhaps that was for the best. The house embraced me through the changing seasons, creaking in winter storms, breathing through open windows in spring, sheltering me in its solid permanence. I planted new cherry trees alongside the one Dad and I had nurtured years ago. I filled the rooms with music and books and friends who became like family. One evening, sitting on the porch swing where Dad and I had spent so many hours, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. The deed that had fallen from his journal that day had changed everything and nothing. This had always been my home, my inheritance in the deepest sense of the word. The property wasn't just land and timber and potential resources beneath the soil. It was memories and legacy and belonging. It was the truest gift my father could have given me. Roots and wings, foundation and freedom. I run my fingers over the worn wood of the swing, feeling the grooves worn by generations of Callaways. Thanks, Dad, I whispered to the twilight. I kept my promise. The house stands silent around me, solid and true, my inheritance,